It says here in this book, the statutes at large being a collection of all the laws of Virginia from the first session of the legislature in the year 1690. It was published pursuant to an act of the General Assembly of Virginia passed on the 5th day of February 1808. All right, they made this book. This is volume 3 of William Waller Henning's Statutes at Large. But I wanted to go to page a little bit more down, 252 here, all right? Because it's going to tell us straight up what they mean about who's mulatto, all right? You ready for this? So it says, and for clearing all manner of doubts, which hereafter may happen to arise upon the construction of this act, or any other act, who shall be accounted a mulatto, all right? So there's no, confusion or disagreements or any things come up, any issues saying, hey, I'm not, who's mulatto? Then so they're gonna make it clear for you, all right, who they talking about when they're talking about mulatto. So it says, be it enacted and declared, and it is hereby enacted and declared that the child of an Indian, all right, the child of an Indian, and the child, grandchild, or great-grandchild of a Negro. So they're separating. They're not saying, they're saying the child of an Indian, and as well as a child or a grandchild, great-grandchild of a Negro shall be deemed, accounted, held, and taken to be a mulatto. You've been classified as a mulatto. Indians and Negroes are the mulattoes. This is from 1705. They were making it clear. All right, so where's the Africans in all this? All right, so again, who is the mulatto? The child of an Indian and the child of a Negro. All right, they shall be deemed, accounted, held, and taken to be a mulatto. And it be all right. So what I have here is the original, what they say here, Virginia Health Bulletin from March 1924. All right. That's volume, 16, number 2. It says the New Virginia Law to preserve racial integrity. This is written by W.A. Plecker. Remember, Walter Plecker. MD is the State Registrar of Vital Statistics, Richmond, Virginia. It says here, Senate Bill 219 to preserve racial integrity. Passed the House March 8, 1924, and is now a law of the state. This bill aims at correcting a condition which only the more thoughtful people of Virginia know the existence of. The new law further provides for the registration of all persons who desire it, and who will make application for such registration of color and birth, remitting at the same time the fee of 25 cents for each applicant. Do not send stamps. These births will be permanently recorded and preserved for all time. You see that? For all time. Do not send stamps. Don't stamp it to that time. Because these births will be permanently recorded and preserved for all time. They want you to be called black, Negro, colored, you know, everything else that is not you. And that's for all time. That was their plan. That was his plan. And it's still going, right? It's still working for all time. And will be a great value for many purposes. Especially to take their land. Such as to prove American citizenship when applying for passports to go abroad. And for establishing and preserving the family tree for future generations. He made it sound all good, right? That you're getting reclassified. Paper genocide. For the purpose of establishing the true color of individuals for the future. Physicians and others who report births and marriages will, as far as possible, use color terms accurately. You see what they're saying? Even the lodges, these orders are going to help out with this. All the organizations and the schools, all right? So they can establish a true color. A true color, like a crayon color. Like crayon, right? So the doctors, as soon as you're born, they're going to do it too. All right? They're going to make sure to have the color terms accurately put in these little forms. They're going to fill out so when you're born. All right? So it says a mulatto is the offspring of a white person and a Negro. All right? So dodge the hijack, right? So in 1924, that's when he's making that official, that a mulatto is what that means. That's what he's saying. But then who's white and who's Negro? All this is messed up. All these classifications. All right? Do you remember my video I did on the this is in what, 1705? Yeah, the black codes. Wow. So he's saying in 1924, right, a mulatto is the offspring of a white person and a Negro. All of a sudden, they included a white person, right? We didn't see that in 1705, and they didn't say anything about offsprings or mixtures when we read that by those, the statutes at large from Virginia, from William Hennon, the official primary source. All right, they said that a mulatto is a child of an Indian, as well as a child of a Negro, grandchild, great-grandchild. You know, like they didn't say nothing about that. If an Indian and a Negro have an offspring, that is a mulatto. They didn't say nothing about offspring, right? You didn't see any word that said offspring or say anything about mixture, right? But 1924, all of a sudden, mulatto means that you have white. All right, but all your family has mulatto in their census records, right? And then all of a sudden they were black. Some of them even went to white, from black to white. All right, so what's happened? These people changing colors over the 10-year periods. All right, so you got to really think about that and dodge your own hijack when you're talking about, oh, my great-grandmother was white or my great-grandfather was white. You got to really look into that. Was he? Do you have a picture of him? I'm not saying that they might not have been, some of them might have been, But I'm just saying, you got to think about all this and research and check out the background behind it. Because these dudes be lying and making up things. Don't you see? That's what I'm trying to show you. So it says, again, a mulatto is the offspring of a white person and a Negro. I have another reference just wanted to go to before I proceed. One moment. Yeah, so in the book Africans and Native Americans by Jack D. Forbes, he has a whole chapter on this. He talks about it a lot throughout the book, but in chapter 7 it says here, the classification of Native Americans as mulattoes in Anglo-North America as mulattoes. You had no mixture. He told you, he showed all the laws and the sources. In the 1700s, they were classifying people as mulatto with no African ancestry, all right? Get the book. All right, go back to the videos if you haven't seen them. All right, so now Walter Pleck is telling you mulattoes are the offspring of a white person and a Negro. See how much it changed, all right, through all these years. It says a quadroon is the offspring of a mulatto and a white person. So now that's all messed up because the mulatto term is messed up. So an octoroon is the offspring of a quadroon and a white person. Wow, you're just making up things here. All right, we continue with this what's called the Racial Integrity Act, or the New Virginia Law to Preserve Racial Integrity. All right, so we already got Dutch the hijack. You know, we already know what they mean. They say mulatto in the old census, and they're trying to make it a mixed thing now with white and black, but it wasn't like that before. So we continue. It says mixtures of either of these crossings with true Negroes should be designated as black, Negro, or colored. All right. So remember, this is when they start making you, they're labeling you these things. All right. The term mixed issue and perhaps one or two others will be understood to mean a mixture of white and black races with the white predominating. All right. That is the class that should be reported with the greatest care, as many of these are on the borderline and constitute the real danger of a race intermixture. They're like, yo, you gotta watch them, because these ones that are mixed, those are the bigger issues, because they're borderline, they might try to call themselves white. We don't want that. They're Negroes. We don't care. So, they might not even be talking about anybody that's mixed. All right. Anyway, it says the term Indian. Now, hear this. Very important. The term Indian, all right, will no longer be accepted for that class. All right. You're not longer an Indian. You're no longer an Indian. All right. We're talking about people that might be labeled black, Negro, or colored, all right, or that might seem mixed. It says the term Indian will no longer be accepted for that class, but must be applied only to those of known pure Indian blood, or those mixed with white. Oh, mixed with white, really? If there is a mixture of Negro, they must not be classed as Indians, but as Negro or mixed Indian. You see that? Oh, how come he's the mixed Indian? So if they're mixed with so-called white, they get to be called a pure Indian blood. You see that? And you see why today, right? And a lot of these reservations, we got to talk honest. There's a lot of white, right, descendants there, or, people that breeded in or mixed into whites mixed in, and they were called pure Indians. According to Walter Plecker, that was an act. That was law. They made law, right? But if you have any mixture of Negro, or if you're a Negro, or they think you might be Negro, they must not be classed as Indians. All right? You're no longer an Indian. Now you're a Negro. But as a Negro, all right, you see? This was an act in 1924, or mixed Indian. Now you're mixed. Now they say mixed with what? Well, descendant of a slave or a Negro, right? An African. Right? Now if you see how they got the hijack going in 1924? So now all these people that, they knew were Indians, but because they look like Negroes or might have been mixed with a Negro, whatever they thought that was, right? They're trying to make you think these are slaves and Africans, right? Now he's a mixed Indian. Now you're mixed. You're not pure, like the one that's white and married into, and he's mixed. No. Now you're the mixed one, or you're the Negro. All right? So again, they're not going to class you as Indians anymore. Not Indians, but as mixed Indian or Negro. Now it says here, Japanese, Chinese, and other Mongolian and Malay races must be designated as such, given the country of their birth or their ancestors. When crossed with white, the race mixture should be indicated as Japanese white. If with blacks, they should be designated as black or Negro. You see that? So if a Japanese, mixes with a Aboriginal, right? They were like, nope, he's a Negro now. So let's forget about his whole heritage, Japanese side, right? See how they were doing it, right? They should be designated as black or Negro, but it may be written Negro Japanese. Oh, Negro Japanese. Wow. All right, so it continues a little bit more and so on. All right, so we're going to just go back to the other book. I just wanted you guys to get familiar, what they were saying in 1924, how they were getting ready to, do their paper genocide. Walter Plecker made this a law and act. You're no longer to be called or classified as an Indian. Instead, you'll be classified as a Negro or mixed Indian. You're not pure blood anymore. This one's called Documentary Genocide, Families, Surnames on Racial Hit List by Peter Hardin. This is a Times dispatch from the Washington Correspondent from March 5, 2000. All right. So long before the Indian woman gave birth to a baby boy, Virginia branded him with a race other than his own. The young Monacan Indian mother delivered her son at Lynchburg General Hospital in 1971. proud of her Indian heritage. The woman was dismayed when hospital officials designated him as black on his birth certificate. All right, so her son was an Indian. She is an Indian. And what did they do? They still put black on his birth certificate. All right, black has no legal, weight. It means nothing. It's a crayon color. Why would they label somebody who is known Indian black? They threatened to bar his discharge unless she acquiesced. The original orders came from Richmond generations ago. Virginia's former longtime registrar of the Bureau of Vital Statistics, Dr. Walter Ashby Plecker. All right, so we got him and his story, who he was and what he did. Right, telling that they couldn't be called Indians anymore. They had to be labeled Negroes, colored, or white. All right. He believed there were no real native-born Indians in Virginia, and anybody claiming to be Indian had a mix of black blood. So anybody Indian? So why are all the Indians? Do they all look colored there? Is that why he's saying they must be black? So he's letting you know that that almost everybody there is colored. All the Indians in Virginia are colored, so they must be black. They have to have some black blood. What do you mean? What does that mean? Black blood? What does that mean? An aggressive policing the color line, he classified pseudo-Indians as black, even issued in 1943 a hit list of surnames belonging to mongrel or mixed blood families suspected of having Negro ancestry who must not be allowed to pass as an Indian or white. With hateful language, he denounced their tactics. Says here, quotes, like rats when you are not watching, they have been sneaking in their birth certificates through their own midwives given either Indian or white racial classification, Plecker wrote. 28 years later, the Monacan mother's surname still was on Plecker's list. She argued forcefully with hospital officials. She lost. So because he was on Plecker's list, her surname, and he had demanded, if you remember, we read the Racial Integrity Act, he demanded all hospitals, all doctors to make sure to not classify these people as Indian, right, when they were first starting. And the people he was doing the census on, they were volunteers. They were volunteering to put themselves as black or Negro. But he made sure that newborns or new people would automatically be classified that, so they wouldn't have the choice. This is what's going on in this case. All right. Today, the woman's eyes reveal her lingering pain. She consulted with civil rights lawyers and eventually wanted correction on her son's birth certificate. All right. It got corrected. He ain't black. He's not black. What do you mean black power? He's not black. Just because he's of dark complexion, he's a Monacan Indian. What the mother is, right? Isn't that their own law? I don't think the prejudice will ever stop, said the woman, who agreed to talk to a reporter only on a condition of anonymity. She waged a personal battle in modern times against the bitter legacy of Plecker, who ran the Bureau from 1912 to 1946. A racial supremacist, Plecker and his influential allies helped shape one of the darkest chapters of Virginia's history. It was an epic of Virginia-sponsored racism. When he perceived Indians as threats to enforcing the color line, he used the tools of his office to endeavor to crush them and deny their existence. Many Western tribes experienced government neglect during the 20th century, but the Virginia story was different. The Indians were consciously targeted for mistreatment. Plecker changed racial labels on vital records to classify Indians as colored. Again, and we got his own words saying this in the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. We actually read it. All right, go back to it or just Google it yourself. All right. He was on purpose, right, changing racial labels on vital records and classifying Indians as what? Colored. Aren't you colored? Ain't your ancestors and your grandparents and everybody, weren't they called colored? That means they were Indians. All right. Investigated the pedigrees of racially suspect citizens and provided information to block or annual interracial marriages with whites. He testified against Indians who challenged the law. Virginia's Indians refused to die out, although untold numbers moved away or assumed a low profile. Now, 8 surviving tribes recognized by Virginia in the 1980s are preparing to seek sovereign status from the U.S. government through an act of Congress. About 3,000 of the 15,000 Indians counted in Virginia in the 1990 census were indigenous to the state, experts say. Indigenous to the state. It's not that we're trying to dig him up and re-enter him again, said Gene Atkins, assistant chief of the Eastern Chickahominy tribe. Chickahominy. We want people to know that he did damage the Indian population here in the state, and it's taken us years, even up to now, to try to get out from under what he did. It's a sad situation, really sad, said Chief William P. Miles of the Pamunkey tribe. He came very close to committing statistical genocide on Native Americans in Virginia, and it was paper genocide. Chief G. Ann Richardson of the Rappahannock tribe spoke bluntly. Devastation, Holocaust, genocide. Those are the words I would use to describe what he did to us. She said, it was obvious his goal was the demise of all Native Americans in Virginia. We were not allowed to be who we are in our own country by officials in the government. They weren't allowing you to be who you are. Necessary confronting an error. On Wooded Bear Mountain, miles up a country road outside Amherst, a visitor finds more evidence of new willingness to confront Plecker's era head-on. It's the historical center of the Monacan Indian Nation. A one-room log schoolhouse dating to the 1870s is standing. Also, there are a simple white church and a small ancestral museum with a new sign proclaiming, "History preserved is knowledge gained." Tribal Activities and researcher Diane Chills digs into her files and pulls out for a visitor a dozen manila folders with photocopies of Plecker's letters covering 2 decades. The Monacans acknowledge the stigma and pain, the second-class status, the lack of economic opportunity, and the inferior education inflicted upon them in other Virginia tribes. Indian children were released to substandard colored schools. Their parents, wanting to keep an Indian identity, often declined to send them there. Alright? So if you send your child to a colored school, what would they do? Cut your hair, they'll try to Europeanize you, whiten you out, erase your whole identity as an Indian, and that's why the parents were like, no, I don't want to send you there. Often declined to send them there. It says some tribal children studied in lower grades at reservation schools or church sponsored schools like the one at Bear Mountain. Even in this history of oppression, some Monacans have found a value of a common identity. It's a horrible thing what he did to the Indian people, Shields said of Plecker. But you know what? It gives me a sense of belonging, because I'm grouped with my own people. It kind of backfired with Plecker. He pushed the Indian people closer and gave us an identity. Her brother Johnny Johns is a tribal leader and electrical technician. He's 51, enrolled at Lynchburg College at midlife. He's been learning about the eugenics movement. Johns, whose surname was on Plecker's hit list, regards him in 2 ways. First, the horror, the terror. Yet he believes Plecker did us a favor because the list of Indian names is there. We know who we are. It's a two-edged sword, duality, alright? So because he made that list, now people can go back to the same list and be like, see, he said we were Indians. We're not Negroes. We're on this Indian list, right? So it kind of backfired to him in that way. In a lot of these treaties as well, like we read yesterday, that because of a treaty, they were able to prove who they are, alright? Monacan Chief Kenneth Brownham, 47, remembers shunning by whites when Indian children were first allowed into public elementary school in the 1960s. School bus drivers sometimes refused to transport them. Plecker was cruel, Branham believes, but he kind of drew us together. We were a tight-knit group because there was nobody else we could associate with. His tribe, which has grown dramatically in recent years to about 1,100 enrolled members, is using federal grant money to document its history. The Monacans are making their comeback with people like Shields and Johns, who were drawn back from beyond Virginia to their family and tribal roots, the place they now call home. Among them is Indian activist Mary B. Wade, who learned only in the late 1980s about her Monacan heritage from an uncle in Maryland. Now she's secretary of the Virginia Council on Indian, a state government advisory panel. The Monacan tribe owns more than 100 acres on and near Bear Mountain and dreams of buying hundreds more, developing a retirement home and a daycare center. These Amherst Indians won recognition from the General Assembly in 1989, 5 years after Lynchburg pediatrician Peter Hoke laid out a Monacan genealogy for what was once called a lost tribe. A lost tribe? The lost tribes? Hoke detailed his finding in book, and the recognition has contributed to a spirit of resurgence among the Monacans. Indian people of Amherst and adjoining Rockbridge counties were a special target of Plecker, he wrote in a 1925 letter. The Amherst Rockbridge group of about 800 similar people are giving us the most trouble. Through actual numbers and persistent claims of being Indians, some well-meaning church workers have established an Indian mission around which they rally. Across the state in eastern Virginia, home for tribes that once made up the Powhatan Confederation, the Powhatan, a lot of tribes under that, Plecker evokes diverse reactions from Indian leaders. He was just determined to get rid of us, said Chief A. Leonard Atkins, 73, of the Chickahominy tribe. Chickahominy. It was hard to believe that a man could do what he did and get away with it. A Chickahominy midwife was threatened with imprisonment by Plecker if she didn't stop putting Indian on birth records. So he was, you see what he was threatening. This happens today, all right? This happens today, all right? And so she didn't want to be classified as a Negro, black, colored, or whatever he was trying to classify her as, and she kept putting Indian, and he threatened to put her in jail. So what do you think she did? Atkins said she decided to stop her midwifery rather than buckle under to him or risk a prison term. Oh man, she had to give up what she was doing. During Plecker's era, a number of Indians didn't admit to their cultural heritage or pass down traditions to their children. It was easier for many to adapt to white society. It's easier to let them call you Negro, colored, or black, African American. That's just easier, right? Said Chief Barry Bass of the Nansemond tribe. All these Virginia tribes, right? There's probably a lot who have gone to their grave who still didn't admit they were Indian. That's millions of people. Millions of people that happened to. They were never able to admit or told anybody that they were Indian. That's where it hurts, says Bass. The acting chairman of the Virginia Council on Indians and the Bass family can trace their lineage right to Indians. Plecker wrote in 1924 state-published pamphlet, Eugenics in Relation to the New Family, that there were no true Indians in Virginia who didn't have some black blood. All right, he wrote that in the Racial Integrity Act, and that's a false lie. That was completely false. And what does he mean by black blood? Because he's going with the whole out of Africa theory, right? He's trying to say these were slaves from Africa. They were mixed. That's what he's trying to say. That's why they were colored. All right. So Plecker says the same thing that some of my followers say, that, oh, well, you know, there was slaves and they did come from Africa, you know, and I ask them for the records and they still can't show them to me. So you're saying the same thing Plecker was saying. He later refined this to apply to native-born people in Virginia, calling themselves Indians. So this was this article. I thought it was pretty good. All right, you know, brief of what was going on in this time. We can keep getting reminded of what was going on. Please go back to my past videos regarding the slavery and the statutory acts that were going on in Virginia. How we broke that down. It was all Indians. They were labeling you Negro. All right, they were labeling you mulatto. They were putting color in your census. We showed real census what these people happened to. We showed Open Mija's relative being labeled white. 10 years later, he was black. So, you know, this really happened. And it did affect your ancestors a lot. All right, so we're talking about Virginia. So let's just continue, all right? Right here it says Studies in History, Economics, and Public Law. Edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University. All right, and it's titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, PhD. All right, Columbia University, 1913. All right, so after the Indian Massacre of 1622 in Virginia, there was published in London in the same year a tract entitled The Relation of the Barbarous Massacre in Time of Peace and League, treacherously executed by the native infidels upon the English, the 22nd of March, 1622, published by authority. The general trend of the tract is to show the good that might result to the plantation from this disaster. Number 5 of the possible results reads, because the Indians who before were used as friends may now most justly be compelled to servitude. In mind, servitude, not slavery, servitude. Remember that. And the like, of whom some may be sent for the use of the summer islands. And I think that was either Bahamas or Barbados. The policy advocated by the tract was carried out in succeeding Indian wars in Virginia. The accounts of a certain Thomas Smallcombe, lieutenant at Fort Royal on Pamunkey, who was probably killed in the war with Ope Chankanu, show him possessed at the time of his death, 1646, of several Indian slaves. It seems probable that these slaves were captives in war. After his rebellion, 1676, Bacon sold some of his Indian prisoners. The rest were disposed of by Governor Berkeley. During the Indian Wars in Virginia, Governor Berkeley himself, in a letter, 1668, to Robert Smith, militia, commander in the Rappahannock country, not only proposed that, with the consent of the Council of War, a war of extinction be waged against the Northern Indians, but also suggested that the colonial government defray the expenses of the undertaking by the disposal of the women and children. Smith submitted Governor Berkeley's letter to the Rappahannock court for approval. In rendering their decision, the justices declared that the conduct of the Northern Indians, notably Duagos, and the neighboring Indians, justified the taking of severe measures against them, and accordingly advised, with the assistance of Almighty God, by the strength of our northern part, utterly to eradicate them, without further encroachment than the spoils of our enemies. We're in the encyclopediavirginia.org website. Only after the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, 1644 to 1646, did Indian slavery become a lucrative part of the Virginia economy. The treaty ending the war defined the tribes and chiefdoms of the Senacomoco as tributaries and subjects to English rule, requiring yearly payment to the crown and dictating where Indians could live, hunt, and trade. To coerce Indians to comply with the treaty, the English also demanded that Indian children shall or will freely or voluntarily come in and live with the English, serving as hostage servants in English households. The English claimed they were educating and converting the children to Christianity as part of the tributary system, but many Indians complained that these children were subsequently sold on the slave market. You see what they were doing, right? Who was being sold on the slave market? Indian children. Encyclopedia Virginia.org says here, by 1649, the enslavement of children in English households and the stealing of Indian children for the slave market was so common that the General Assembly enacted 2 laws, one stipulating that no tributary children could be sold as slaves, the other that they could not be kept in households after the age of 25. The Assembly passed similar prohibitions in 1655, 1656, and 1657, outlining punishments for anyone stealing and enslaving Indian children. Despite these laws, by the late 17th century, many Indians refused to bring their children to English households due to the threat of enslavement. And even as Virginia prohibited the enslavement of Indian children, the government sometimes encouraged it. Officials in Accomack County, for instance, on June 16, 1670, commissioned a man they called Mr. John to find Indian children to sell to the settlers. Similarly, in 1666, Governor Sir William Berkeley presided over the General Court and declared that hostilities with the tribes of the Northern Neck be revenged by utter destruction, and that taking their women and children and their goods, example, selling them, would compensate the colony for the cost of the expedition, although a 1670 law indicated that captives should be servants who are freed at age 30 and not slaves bound to a lifetime of a forced labor. The law was largely ignored. All right, so they say, okay, no, we'll start them out as servants, and they'll be able to, be free at age 30. But this law was largely ignored. After 1646, Indian labor was more common in many forms, from child hostages to indentured servants to slaves. These enslaved Indians worked in the fields and as house servants, interpreters, hunters, and guides. English colonists preferred enslaved Indians, women, and children as domestic laborers rather than African or white laborers because they were considered easiest to train and control. Indian men were perceived to pose a greater risk of obstinacy and escape, and so they were often profitably sold to American buyers as far away as New England or to the sugar plantations in the West Indies where they could not escape. So you see, they're not Africans who are arriving in these places. There's other Indians. We're going to get, if you really do the research, you'll see, chase it, chase the trail. You'll see where you end up. You end up with American Indians, not Africans. The historian Everett has argued that when these external markets became available, financial incentive overtook vengeance as the primary driver of Indian enslavement. When the English colonists began to participate in an existing Indian trade that involved slaves and guns, Indian enslavement briefly became an important part of the colonial economy. All right, so now we're in this book, and it's part of the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science. And it's called A History of Slavery in Virginia by James Curtis Bala, Associate in History at Johns Hopkins University. All right, 1902. This was true also of the subject Indian. All right, we're just talking about you this whole time, Negroes and Indians, up to the 1670 in Virginia, when an act reduced the few Indians that might be imported by sea. By sea, Indians imported by sea, Indians, not Africans. Now, they're not just calling you Negroes. So Indians imported by sea in ships, presumably from the West Indies or the Spanish Main, to a state of slavery. The great body of Indian subjects, being native, however, remained servants up to 1676, when in the exigencies of the Indian War, captives were made slaves by one of Bacon's laws. Before this time, no native Indian, whether a child sold by its parent or a captive of warring tribes, could be legally held as a slave. Acts were passed in 1655 and in 1661 specifically prohibiting Indian slavery and guaranteeing to such Indians all the rights of English servants. So Indians got rights just like the English servants. So what rights did the English servants have? All right, you're still a servant. When the attempt was made to reduce them to slavery, freedom might readily be obtained by appeal to the courts. And that's where we get a lot of these cases and court cases of Indians trying to prove they're Indians so they can get their freedom and so they won't be called Negroes. In 1682, Indian slavery was extended to captives sold by tributary Indians in the hope of mitigating their condition, as it was certain that they would be held in slavery by their captors. In 1691, however, Indian slavery was finally abolished by law. The religious doctrine of freedom, inherent in Christianity, began to wane as a practical principle and to be supplanted by the more profitable social principle of fundamental racial difference. So by an act of 1682, you hearing all this? The benefits of Christianity as a mode of securing freedom were definitely denied to all Negroes, mulattoes, hostile Moors, and Turks. See how they separate from the Moors and Turks, the Negroes and mulattoes? And to such Indians as were sold by other Indians as slaves for original heathenism could be affirmed. All right, so people kind of getting their freedom using the whole Christianity thing. So they kind of made an act or law to say, hey, no, we got to stop that. All right, so it included all these people who were doing it. That's for a second time, Indian slavery. And for the first time, the slave trade by Indians were legalized. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler Lauber, PhD. In 1682, the gradual process of change from the status of Indian servitude to that of Indian slavery was completed. The Virginia Act of 1670 had declared a condition of slavery for all Indians imported into the colony by sea, but the great body of subject Indians were natives of the country. Such Indians remained servants up to 1676, when at the beginning of the Indian War, one of the Bacon's laws made all Indian captives slaves. All right, back in the book, Judicial Cases Concerning American Slavery and the Negro. And it says here, however, the colonists did not depend on traffic or kidnapping for their supply of Indian slaves, but took the enemy pagan by their own prowess in war, and enslaved him long before the passage of the Virginia Acts of 1676 and 1679, when forces were being raised in Maryland in 1652 for a march against the Eastern Shore Indians. Such Indian prisoners as shall happen to be taken are declared to the spoil of those who financed the expedition. Indians were also reduced to slavery and punishment for crime. Thus, we have shown that the first slaves in the colony of Virginia, all right, listen, the first slaves or servants, indentured servitude, right, in the colony of Virginia were Indians, not Negroes, so-called Negroes, Indians, and that the laws of the colony sanctioned Indian slavery except as regard prospective importations by land. For a few years after the passage of the Act of 1670, the practice of the colonists in accordance with their laws is illustrated by cases in the courts of Virginia and Maryland. From 1627 to 1831 and 1627, some Indians of the Carib Islands were brought into the country, Virginia, in 1627 by Captain Sampson, but the experiment was too disastrous to warrant repetition, at least on a wholesale scale. Alright, Carib Indians.
I'm going to quickly read from this book. It's called Indians of North America, the Powhatan Tribes by Christian F. Feast. So this is like the area that we're going to be focusing on in some of these tribes. Just like the Rappahannock, the Mattaponi, the Pamunkey, Chickahominy, Powhatan, right? This whole thing is a Powhatan. So on page 69 of this book, in regards to the black coats in Virginia that they were established in, I believe, let me see, it tells me years, 1705. All right, so it says down here in the bottom, it says, at the same time, however, the black code classified those Indians living outside the reservations as free persons of color. So they made an imaginary line, right? And they created the reservations. So if you were outside of that imaginary line, you were actually, instead of called an Indian or classified as an Indian, you were being classified of a free person of color. What does that tell you? That that person was a so-called Negro, right? Who are they calling colored this whole time in the United States? Right? You know that, right? So look how they play with words, simply because you're on one side of the fence. A legal status they shared with free blacks and mulattoes. So a legal status they shared with free blacks and mulattoes. So they're telling you straight up that the term free colored actually meant Indians, because it says that they meant the same legal status as free blacks, another term, right? Another tag they put on you, and mulattoes. Again, mulatto, right? That word mulatto, we've already gone over that. All right, we see it again here. Indians so classified were now prohibited from hunting on lands claimed by white Virginians. They were also barred from holding public office and from serving as witnesses in courts of law. Marriages between Indians and whites had already been outlawed in 1691, despite the example of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. Now, children with one Indian parent were defined as mulattoes, whether the other parent was black or white. So if you get an Indian, which is a so-called Negro, right, with another black or another so-called Indian, right, you know, they play with all these words here, but we're talking about the same people. They considered that a mulatto just because one was classified as an Indian. So it's not about just white people mixing with Africans. That's not the whole definition of mulatto. We see that it was applied different here as well. Moreover, all children were classified as mulattoes if they had one black parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent. All right, so if you have a little bit of so-called Negro in you, you are automatically a mulatto. Only a thin line, a bloodline, now separated a reservation Indian who possessed acknowledged rights and privileges from an off-reservation one who was legally designated as colored. He was legally designated as colored. They're talking about Indians and had a much lower social status. Although the latter were not enslaved, some plantation owners probably forced their Indian servants into marriage with blacks so that the children could be claimed as slaves. Indian children claimed as slaves.
All right, so I want to give a big ups to Opemija, all right, his YouTube channel, and it was regarding the Kikotan Indians, the Kikotan, all right, and how does that relate to the tan Negroes, all right? So he goes into this website, right? It's called freeafricanamericans.com. Free, they were free. A lot of them were born free. He reads this to us all the time, the different surnames and locations, all right, the genealogy of these people, their true history, how they own land and everything. But in this particular case, he found something very interesting, which I thought it was really interesting, and I make sure that everybody knew. All right, so let's just get a little bit of him, Alpemija. Again, make sure to subscribe to him, hit like and all that.
So the family that I was just happened to be looking through was the Tan family. Okay. It says John Kikotan, born about 1636, had been the slave of the whole family of Charles City, County, Virginia for about 29 years on October 14th, 1665, when he appealed to the governor and council of Virginia for his freedom. So, of course, we're going to dodge all hijacks. We're going to understand and overstand what we're reading. So just, keep that in mind.
All right, so yeah, keep that in mind for sure, right? Because he was an indentured servant, actually. All right, it's not about slaves. So what's interesting here is the last name that he's referred to, because he's Tan, but he's right here as referred to as John Kikotan. So we got the Tan, but we got the Tan at the end, the Kikotan. All right. All right, so let me just go a little bit ahead.
John Kikotan, or Kikotan. Now pay attention to how these names are being spelled, and I'll show you the correlation in the hijack. Born about 1670, was a 7-year-old mulatto boy, bound until the age of 24 on November 3rd, 1677, when Stephen Lewis sold the remainder of his indenture to William Edwards by Surrey County deed for 2,500 pounds of tobacco.
All right. So many things here to point out. First thing, they're calling him a mulatto, right? A mulatto boy. Mulatto. But I thought he was an African. You see, they call him a mulatto. And remember, that's a key word right there. A lot of times that just means Indian. All right. And again, what did it tell you? He was bound until the age of 24. He wasn't a slave. He was a bound, indentured child. Remember, we just got indentured children. All right, in Rhode Island and Narragansett and all that, we got Indians, native indentured children. All right, so he was bound, and then his indenture was sold to William Edwards by Surrey deed for 2,500 pounds of tobacco. All right. So whatever was left over in his contract, John Kikotan, it was sold to William, his contract, his indenture. You see, they was selling your indenture around, your contract, your service. They were selling your service around. All right. He was called a mulatto boy named John Kikotan. All right. So he goes into it. He's letting you know. Opemi has let you know that he was like interested in finding out about the name, the Kikotan, and all that.
So let me show you the hijack. So it takes you to this Wikipedia page where it says Kikotan, Virginia, and let's read. Kikotan in Virginia was originally named Kikotan, also spelled Kikotan. So all the different spellings of that surname. The name of the Algonquin Native Americans living there when the English colonists arrived in the Hampton Roads area in 1607. So that's a bomb right there. So it's telling you that the surname Kikotan or Tan actually comes from this Native American or American Indian group of people. So that's undeniable proof as far as I'm concerned. So let's keep reading.
All right, so boom, major boom, like Opie said, man, and that's a major boom. This surname that eventually became the Tan, which was, given to, or a lot of so-called Negroes had, right, in this area and region. I was actually a Native American word. It was a surname of family, an Indian tribe of Virginia, the Kikotan. All right, it's Access Genealogy, a free genealogy website. All right, actually very good. I was looking into it. And I'll go into the, they have all these tribes here in Virginia, so you can go to by state. You can find the tribes by state. I went to Virginia, and it lists all these different tribes here. All right, so I went to Powhatan Indians, right? So we're in the Powhatan, all right? And then it gives you the different, says Powhatan sub-tribes constituted in this group are as follows, all right? And it gives you all these tribes, right? And look at one of them right here, Kikotan. And Elizabeth City County, Kikotan. All right, Kikotan. Then we got Old Kikotan, right? Old Kikotan. This is another scholarly thing from the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 9. And it's telling us Old Kikotan. There are records of Elizabeth City County, the details of a suit and ejectment, which are interesting not only for the legal phases that illustrate the course of law in the colony, but for the information they gave about early settlement of Elizabeth City County. When the first immigrants arrived in Virginia, they found an Indian village near Point Comfort. All right, you see, this is where they landed, supposedly in 1619, Point Comfort. All right, this first so-called Negroes. All right, called Kikotan. There was an Indian village called Kikotan or Kikutan or Kikotan. There was in the neighborhood a large open country of 2,000 or 3,000 acres in which the Indians raised their corn. All right, you hear what's going on? Who's these Indians? Today, they are the Tans. They became Tan. They was always tan when you're talking about complexion, right? Kikutan. But they were Indians. They were aboriginals. Today, they're known as African Americans or Negroes, colored people, free people of color, or in that website, as it says, free African Americans. How they African Americans of their Kikutan Indians, of sub-tribe of the Powhatan, who actually met the first colonists, all right, who had a large open country of 2,000 or 3,000 acres, 2,000 or 3,000 acres, in which the Indians raised their corn, beans, and tobacco. Tobacco. Who was raising tobacco? Indians, not Africans. This is a native plant of America, tobacco. Again, Powhatan, we got another source telling us they were the ones who had plantations, large plantations of beans, corns, and tobacco. So again, we're in the book, Let Me Be a Free Man, a documentary history of Indian resistance. And this is part 1 of the book, The Conquest, 1607 to 1890. It says here the Powhatan Indians were a farming people who raised corn, tobacco, and a variety of other crops. So who's raising corn and tobacco? Tobacco, the Powhatan Indians, right? So when they show you, these images of so-called Negroes, in the fields, in the tobacco fields, right? Then you know who really it is. All right. Says King Powhatan, why should you destroy us? The first English colony in the New World was established in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607 as a profit-making enterprise by London's Joint Stock Company. All right. A what? A company for profit-making, an enterprise, a joint stock company. And we already know from the past videos who was involved in this joint stock company. And let's include King James, or the Duke of York in this, as he was known also, the Duke of York, King James. All right. The colony's founders were restless men, hungry for land, hungry for your land, so-called Negroes, American Indians. They wanted your land, hungry for land and economic gain. The Powhatan Indians of the Virginia coast brought corn and tobacco to the colonists in the hope of establishing friendly relations. Their gifts were accepted, and for a time Indians and whites lived together in peace. But because of the white man's greed, this peace did not last. Tobacco, which the Indians used for ceremonial purposes, was seen as a source of profit by the colonists. Again, who was using tobacco for ceremonial purposes? The Powhatan Indians. And what did the colonists say? Yo, we can make money off of that. All right. As their rapidly expanding tobacco plantations used up the soil, the colonists took over the Indians' fields, pushing the natives aside to enlarge their country estates. The English seized ever larger tracts of Indian land. All right. So whose fields were they? They were the Indians' fields. What fields? Tobacco fields. So you see all these images showing fields of tobacco and an Indian, a so-called Negro, right? American Indian holding or farming it, right? They're showing that you were the one planting. This was your fields, your tobacco fields, all right? You already had them before the colonists came. You were already planting this. You had plantations of your own, all right? And they're telling you right here, they took over that. They saw something positive here for them financially, you know, and so they wanted to make money. They just, you know, kept you to working it. You know, when they took over, they just kept you growing it. They didn't bring no other Africans or other people that never knew about tobacco. Tobacco's a plant native to America. All right, that's an American plant. So how can somebody come from across the continent, right, across the ocean, and start growing it all of a sudden, right? But we know they were just depicting you, your ancestors. This was your field, all right? They pushed you aside. They said pushing the natives aside. They took over your fields. The colonists took over the Indian fields, pushing the natives aside to enlarge their country estates. The English seized ever larger tracts of Indian land. The leader of the Powhatan tribe was Chief Wahunsona Cock, whom the English colonists dubbed King Powhatan. All right, so his name, Wahunsona Cock. Wahun, Au, Wahu, Ahua, Wahua, Waha, Wahasona Cock, Wahunsona Cook, whom the English colonists dubbed King Powhatan. Long before the arrival of the colonists, the powerful chief had forged a confederacy of some 30 tribes. Now he pledged to resist the colonists' encroachment. When the English threatened to use force to drive the Indians from their homeland, King Powhatan made this plea: "Why should you take by force from us that which you can obtain by love? Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? I am not so simple as not to know that it is better to eat good meat, be well, and sleep quietly with my women and children, to laugh and be merry with the English, and being their friend, to have copper hatchets and whatever else I want." All right, seems he wanted peace. He didn't want to fight. Unfortunately, the peaceful coexistence King Powhatan hoped for was not to be. Once the young colony of Jamestown was on its feet, its founders sought to banish the Indians who had helped them survive in the early years. They turned their backs on you. When the white man's threats became bolder, the Indians retaliated, fighting for what was theirs. But the colonists met force with even greater force, and by the time the wars ended, thousands of the Powhatan Indians had been annihilated.